Movies. Should they stop existing? Some would argue yes. Hi, I'm Lee, and I watched 34 movies in 2025. Not a lot, but hey, I want to talk about them anyway. I logged 35 movies on Letterboxd, so there is one movie that I watched twice, and it's up to you to figure out which one before it gets revealed. Here's the thing. You need to have a little bit of knowledge about who I am and what my interests are, because it's not one you would ever guess otherwise. But if you know even the barest amount about myself and the kind of content that I've made in the past, you can probably figure it out. Anyway, like I said, I don't watch many movies. I actually really like to play this game with my friends where I tell them to name a movie, any movie, and in 9 times out of 10, I have not seen it. I just don't watch movies very often. It's not really my thing. Yeah, I don't know. I'm a theater person instead. I know that's very surprising to everybody, but it actually turns out that a good portion of the movies that I logged on Letterboxd this year are just filmed theater performances. So I'll also address those when they come up. But yeah, to the surprise of absolutely no one, I have incredibly strong opinions about pretty much everything, and I decided because this is my channel and I can do what I want, I am going to force all of you to listen to those opinions. So, let's get started. We're going to go in chronological order from when I saw the movie, and I'm going to give you my star rating and any sort of general thoughts that I had about the movie. Okay, so the first movie I watched in 2025 was actually on February 2nd, which kind of gives you a sort of idea of how I sort of operate. I'm not watching many movies, and it actually, I didn't even watch it myself. My now girlfriend made me watch it with her. It is Velvet Goldmine. I gave it 5 stars. It's fucking Velvet Goldmine. It's fucking awesome. I had a wonderful time. Obviously, it's been almost a year now since I saw it, so I don't have the clearest memories of it, but it was just an awesome movie. It was just a lot of fun. It was also really heartbreaking, and hey, I love watching gay sex. Anyway, the second movie I watched was on February 9th, and it is actually a documentary called After Stonewall, which I had to watch for a class. For like a gender and sexuality studies class. It's basically just a documentary that goes through like the general things that have happened in the like queer rights movement and in the queer community since Stonewall. It touches on Stonewall a little bit, and then it goes into the 70s and then the 80s with the AIDS crisis, and then it sort of ends in like the early 2000s when the film was made. I gave it 3 stars. It's fine. It's interesting. There are some, like, cool figures that are interviewed in it. Rita Mae Brown is interviewed in it, which is kind of crazy. And, like, there are a couple, like, Combahee River Collective people that are interviewed. And they all have really interesting things to say about, like, the decline of the queer rights movement at the time that the documentary was being made. It sort of ends on a bit of, like, a grim note with, like, the sort of push for gay marriage and, like, gay people in the military and this sort of, like, assimilationist rhetoric taking over queer spaces and excluding, trans people and people of color, and sort of just pushing forward this very mainstream, very palatable view of what queerness is. There are a couple of gay cops interviewed in the documentary, which, like, fuck that. So, yeah, it's an interesting watch, I would say. It's definitely informative if you are someone who doesn't know too much about, like, post-Stonewall to today queer history. I already did know 90% of the things that were said in the documentary, not to, like, toot my own horn, but, I am gay, so I know queer history because I feel like it's important to know. But I do think it is a useful resource, like a good place to start if you don't really know where to start and you're trying to learn more about, like, sort of modern queer history. I would recommend After Stonewall as, like, a good starting point. It's not perfect. It's not, like, the best resource, but there is a lot of good information in there that I think is useful. Okay, then we are jumping forward a lot to March 20th. I watched another documentary, Forbidden, Undocumented and Queer in Rural America. This was for that same class. I gave this one 3.5 stars. This one follows a young man named Moises Serrano. He is an undocumented person living in North Carolina, I think it was, or Virginia, or like somewhere in like sort of the rural South. He like came to America when he was like a couple months old, and he has been like living as undocumented his entire life, and so he like wasn't able to go to college, and he's sort of like the face of this kind of like undocu-queer movement. Undocu-queer, like queer undocumented people. And then eventually with like DACA and everything, he is able to go to college. He goes to Sarah Lawrence at the end of the documentary. I gave it 3.5 stars because while I think that like he's an incredible individual and his story is really important and like cool, it is still very much like this narrative of like exceptionalism and like individual achievement. It's very much like focused on the fact that he was just a kid when he came here. He didn't have a choice in the matter. He shouldn't be punished because he's basically an American because he's been here for as long as he remembers. And like this idea that like he's not one of the bad ones, so he should get to stay and he should get his rights. It is still like sort of negotiated through this lens of determining who is and isn't worthy of being a United States citizen, and sort of making the argument that him and the other young people like him are worthy, but not really interrogating super closely the entire idea of immigration, or sort of, tackling the idea of like no one's illegal on stolen land or anything like that. And so I would say that it is a very liberal documentary, bordering on progressive at times, but ultimately it's a bit disappointing in the way that it doesn't push all the way further to talk about like sort of the abolition of borders or anything like that. Okay, so the fourth movie that I watched last year was on the 23rd of March, and it was the global live stream of the Terrible Influence Tour. Now, you may have heard a little something about Dan and Phil more recently, but we're talking about Dan and Phil way back towards the beginning of 2025 when they released the film version of their stage show, Terrible Influence. I love Terrible Influence. I loved it when I saw it. I love watching it. It's just such a love letter to like Dan and Phil as like Dan and Phil, like capital Dan and Phil as like a media empire, and like a love letter to their fans who've like stuck with them through all of these sort of different iterations of what Dan and Phil is, and just like such a sort of hopeful look towards the future of what Dan and Phil can become. And there's also Sister Daniel, and if you are not familiar with Sister Daniel, you should get familiar with Sister Daniel. So yeah, I love Terrible Influence. I gave it 5 stars because it's fucking Terrible Influence. I was able to watch it with a whole bunch of friends. We got together and we watched the live stream, which was just a lot of fun. It was really nice because when the We're All Doomed global live stream happened, I watched it alone because at the time I didn't really have like Dan and Phil fan friends. Ugh. That was crazy. But I didn't really have like a whole lot of friends who were like interested in Dan and Phil, and since then I have gained a lot more friends at school who are into Dan and Phil, and it was really nice to like get together and watch this and be like, wow, in like a year it went from like me watching this alone in my dorm room to watching it with friends. So it was just really nice. It was a really fun viewing experience, and I love Dan and Phil so much. Okay, the next film I watched was on the 27th of March. It is a film called Paper Dolls. It was another film that I watched for this same like gender and sexuality studies course. I gave it 2 stars. It's another, like, documentary. This one follows, this group of, like, drag queen sort of cabaret performers, who are, like, Filipina, like, trans femme and, like, gay sort of, Filipina migrant workers in Israel. And they mostly do, like care work, and it says at the beginning of the film the reason why they're there is because Israel, like, expelled all the Palestinians who were doing the jobs that, these women then had to come and fulfill. The subjects of the documentary, these, like, trans women, are incredible. They are such, like, they just all seem like such wonderful people who have been through so much bullshit and yet are still, like, they're just so wonderful. And they're, like, so, yeah, it was amazing to see them and to see them perform and to, like, take so much joy in their performances and in their, like, friendship with each other. However, the director of the documentary, was an absolute piece of shit. There are several moments in the film where he, like, asks very invasive questions about their, like, gender identities and their bodies, and he just seems to not really understand transness and to not understand, like, this sort of, also he's not very sensitive about, like, the sort of racial dynamics of him being, like, a white Israeli, interviewing these Filipino migrants. It's just, yeah, he's a real piece of shit. He really takes advantage of them. And, like, they seem to understand that to a certain extent, but, like, he is really, like, co-opting their story, for his own sort of gain in this really insidious and gross way. And so it was just, yeah, it's just hard to sort of square that, where, like, this story is so cool and so, like, interesting, and yet the person telling this story is such a piece of shit that it makes it hard to really focus on the story being told, because you're like, God, can this guy just shut up? I'm also going to read from my Letterboxd reviews when I think it's necessary and when I think that it sort of like, when it puts stuff better than I can put them now, with, like, the distance between when I saw these films. I said in my review, like, I don't understand why you would make a documentary about Filipina trans women when you just don't understand what it means to be trans. It just seems like voyeurism and a perverse fascination with the other. Still manages to be a pretty apt depiction of how Israel treats non-white, non-Jewish people as second-class citizens, even while the existence of Palestinians was completely erased. Yeah, it's an incredibly interesting film. I think if it sounds like something that you're interested in and interested to, like, dive into and really, like, grapple with those sort of, like, nuances, I think it's a good watch, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I recommend it. Okay, on April 14th, I watched Sufjan Stevens' Carrie and Lowell live. I guess I was feeling like I wanted to kill myself, or something. I gave it 5 stars, because it's fucking Sufjan Stevens. Apparently this was during Passover, because I wrote in my Letterboxd review, Pesach Sameach, I may be converting to Christianity after this, though. So, yeah, it's available for free on YouTube. It's a fucking Sufjan Stevens concert film. If you like Sufjan Stevens, which why wouldn't you? Frickin' watch it, man. Okay, then we have one that might be a bit controversial. On the 22nd of April, I watched The Green Knight. I gave it 3 stars. Here's the thing. I watched The Green Knight because I love Sir Gawain and The Green Knight. I have read it like 3 times in the past 3 years for 3 separate classes. You know, if you take a course on medieval literature, you're probably gonna read Sir Gawain at some point. And I love the story so much. It's such an interesting, like, examination of, like, queerness and homosexuality, and I'm just obsessed with those sort of themes. The problem for me with The Green Knight, the film, is that for me, and maybe this is because I've written like way too many papers about it, the vow of celibacy that like the Arthurian knights take is like so important in my mind to what makes them interesting, where, you know, it feminizes them, but it's also like a symbol of their masculinity, and like it creates this very homosocial space, and there's like, yeah, there's just a lot going on with this like vow of celibacy that I think is so integral to Gawain and so integral to like so much other like so much other Arthuriana. And also, Gawain is supposed to be young. Like, really young. Like, 16, 17. Like, you know, there's no, like, explicit age given, but it is implied that he's very young. And so I just think that Dev Patel was not the right choice for this role, especially with the fucking beard. And, you know, obviously you're allowed to interpret the story in whatever way you want, and you are allowed to make a version of The Green Knight where Gawain fucks. But in my mind, that's not the interesting version of Gawain, and so I'm allowed to not like it. So I just kind of disagreed with this movie on principle for the fact that it cast this grown-ass man with a beard as Gawain, and the fact that he had this lesbian-looking girlfriend who was so written by a man it made me feel sick, because it was just like, she was just there to be the girlfriend. And she was such an unnecessary character that did not need to exist, and it was just, this movie didn't like women very much, which, you know, historically accurate, but I do think there is a difference between recognizing that and someone writing women poorly because they just don't know how to write women, even in our modern time. And I would say that this movie falls into the latter camp. So I didn't really like the inclusion of Gawain's girlfriend, not only because it broke the sort of vow of celibacy thing, but also because I just think she was incredibly underwritten. Also, this movie's just kind of homophobic. And it just pisses me off so much because, so, in the original tale, Gawain does not have sex with Lady Bertilac. They don't do anything like that. It's just kissing, right? And obviously there's an implication if she wants it to go further, but he never lets it because of the whole vow of celibacy, and he wants to, like, remain pure and everything because he's so pure. But in this version, Lady Bertilac jerks him off. But he still only gives Lord Bertilac a little kissy. And I think that's just homophobic. I do genuinely just think that's a fucking homophobic choice. Not only does it make no sense within the context of the story, but it also just shows an uncomfortability with, like, gay sex on screen in a way that is just really gross to me, where, like, when you are adapting a story that is so regarded as queer, and so entrenched in sort of that sort of history of being interpreted in this queer way, you can't just back off of that and try to minimize that. And I felt like this movie was really trying to minimize that. And it really pissed me off. I will admit, it's an objectively beautiful movie. It looks great. It's a great looking movie. Doesn't mean I liked anything else about it, though. What did I say in my Letterboxd review? I said, kind of pathetic that there was only one measly man kiss in there, though. And you would think that since Lady Bertilac jerked him off, he would have to do the same to Lord Bertilac, but I guess we're too cowardly for some real man-on-man action in a movie which, I would argue, has far too much man-on-woman action for the story it's based on. I would say that that's the TLDR of my review of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Too much man-on-woman action, not enough man-on-man action. Okay, April 24th, I watched Conclave. Now, if you do a quick little Google, you will see why I watched Conclave at this time. This was actually a watch party organized by my girlfriend, who was my girlfriend at this point, when the Pope because she always said when the Pope dies, she was going to get everyone together and make them watch Conclave, and she did, and I had not seen Conclave before this, because I was waiting for the Pope to die so I could watch it. I gave it 4.5 stars. What? I loved Conclave. I thought it was so fun. I obviously have no connection with Catholicism, and so I don't really understand it all that much, but I just thought it was such a fun drama, and it was funny, and it was engaging, and it was great. There were also turtles in it, and whenever a movie has a turtle in it, I give it a bonus point, because that makes Martin happy. I said I loved how Jewish all these Catholic men were acting. They were all acting very Jewish for Catholic men, and I thought that was awesome. You know, not really believing in God, you know, going around fighting with each other about everything. Very Jewish, very fun. I understand the, like, critique of it, that it kind of ends on this very liberal note of, like, progressivism, and that there will be, like, a better, like, with this new Pope in charge, that the Catholic Church will be better, and, like, the institution itself can change, which, you know, I don't really agree with. However, the movie was fun enough for me to overlook that. Okay, so on May 1st, I watched Call Her Ganda. It's another documentary film that I watched for that same gender sexuality studies class. This film is about the murder of a Filipina trans woman, Jennifer Laude. She was murdered by Joseph Scott Pemberton, who was a U.S. Marine stationed in the Philippines. I wrote in my Letterboxd review, it's definitely one of the most viscerally upsetting films I've seen in a long time, and that is absolutely true. It's just a film that makes you feel really bad, because everything is so fucked. It follows, like, her family's fight to bring justice to her and to Pemberton, but, you know, it's incredibly tough because in addition to fighting him, they are also fighting the entirety of, like, the U.S. military-industrial complex that wants to protect this man and wants to keep the Philippines, like, subservient to, like, U.S. imperialism. Yeah, I gave it 4.5 stars. It's an incredible documentary. It will make you feel terrible. And you know what? I think that that's important, because it's an incredibly important story about just the evils of imperialism and how they intersect with, like, queer and trans issues. And I think that, you know, I think that there's something to be said about the current relevance of that. Okay, on May 8th, I watched Akira. This was a watch party that another one of my friends hosted, where she got a bunch of people together and made us all watch Akira. I came in a little late. I missed, like, the first 5 minutes or so, and according to everybody else there, I didn't actually miss too much, even though I was confused for the entire rest of the movie, but apparently that's just how Akira is. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's Akira. It's great. It's terrifying. It's so fucked, and it is awesome. On May 9th, I rewatched Bigger with Brennan and Izzy. I had watched this previously. This was my second time watching it, at least. I might not have vlogged every time I watched it. If you don't know, it's on Dropout. It is Brennan Lee Mulligan and Izzy Rowland's, like, long-form improv show where it's just the two of them, and they are just so funny, and they make me happy. And so I guess that I was probably upset about something on May 9th, and that's why I watched it, because it makes me feel better. 5 stars. On May 18th, I watched Royal Shakespeare Company Live, Henry IV, Part 1. I actually am not incredibly familiar with, like, Henry IV, the play. This was my first time watching or reading it. But I really didn't find myself that impressed by this production. I gave it 3 stars. It's just, I didn't end up watching Part 2 because I've heard that Part 2 is worse than Part 1, and it was so fucking boring. Like, it's just boring. Like, I'm not one to say that, like, oh, Shakespeare's boring, old things are boring. I do think that Henry IV is a little boring. I think it is possible to make it incredibly interesting, and I think the RSC did not do that, as they often do not. Okay, 29th of May. It's time to reveal the film that I watched twice this year. Get your guesses in. It was Terrible Influence Tour. I believe this was the day that it was, like, released on YouTube, which makes sense as to why I watched it again. I think I watched it at least 1 or 2 more times in its entirety this year. I just kind of stopped logging it after this point because it was just going to be like Terrible Influence 5 stars, Terrible Influence 5 stars. But yeah, I watched it again. Fucking love Terrible Influence. Terrible. Say it to my face, you want to influence me. Okay, on May 30th, I watched another RSC live production. This time I watched Othello. I, again, hadn't seen or read Othello before. You know, I'm, like, vaguely familiar with it, but I had never, like, actually sat down and watched a full production. This one I did give 5 stars. I don't know if I was more familiar with Othello going in, if I would have still given it that, but they had water on stage, and that goes a long way for me, because that was freaking epic. So I gave it 5 stars. July 9th, another RSC production, this time The Winter's Tale. This one I gave 3 stars, not because of necessarily anything on the part of the production, but because it's The Winter's Tale, and what I learned when I watched this is that The Winter's Tale is not one of Shakespeare's best. I will say I love the costuming, because, like, there's like a big time gap between the, like, first and second sort of halves of The Winter's Tale, where the first half is, like, kind of this bullshit, stupid, like, melodrama thing that I didn't really care about, and the second act is, like, a fun comedy, which I enjoyed a lot more, and there's, like, 18 years or something in between them, and so the costuming in the first half was very, like, sort of 40s, 50s, and then second half it was like 60s, 70s, which I really enjoyed. Yeah, I think The Winter's Tale is just not a great play. I saw a lot of people, I think a lot of people just are wrong about the function of drama. And a lot of people are like, wow, the first act was, like, so cool and, like, dramatic, and then the second act was really stupid. And in my opinion, the first act was just drama for the sake of drama, melodrama for the sake of melodrama, a lot of screaming and crying for no apparent reason that didn't really do anything or serve anyone in any sort of way. And then the second act was the comedy, which is fun, but still had, like, those sort of serious moments. That's my hot take, and that specific take about not liking too much screaming and crying in melodrama will come back later. Also, Asad Zaman was in it. So, and he's only in the second part. So I was watching it, like, totally normal, and then I was like, holy shit, it's the Vampire Armand. So that was pretty cool, because I did not realize he was in it. Still, though, 3 stars. I think The Winter's Tale is an incredibly interesting play in the way that it is quite bad. Okay, August 14th, another rewatch, although not a film that I rewatched previously this year. It is Falsettos. This is actually one of my Letterboxd top 4s. I gave it 5 stars, obviously, because it's Falsettos. I love Falsettos. It's my favorite musical. And I was feeling sad in Paris, and so I put it on the TV in Paris, and I watched it, and it made me feel better, even though it's Falsettos, because it reminded me that stuff can be good. And sometimes you need a reminder that, like, not all musicals are bad. August 20th, another rewatch, although not a film I watched previously this year. It is The Favorite. I rewatched this because, for some reason, it was available with Air France's in-flight entertainment. And I was like, hey, I love that movie. I'll rewatch it. So I gave it 5 stars. I love Yuri. Another film that I watched on this same flight is Little Miss Sunshine. I had not seen Little Miss Sunshine before because, like I said, I don't tend to watch movies very often, but I gave it 5 stars. And I was kind of just as surprised as anyone that I actually liked Little Miss Sunshine, because usually when people are like, oh, this movie is so good, you're gonna love it, I'm usually like, it's not woke enough for me. But Little Miss Sunshine actually kind of was, and I really liked it. It's just like a good movie. So yeah, I liked Little Miss Sunshine because it's Little Miss Sunshine. And I realized that there truly are just some movies that even I can't hate just because they're popular. 29th of August, another Dropout.tv pick is Cameron Esposito, Four Pills. This is Cameron Esposito's, like, stand-up show that was recorded for Dropout. I gave it 4.5 stars. I said I was totally paying attention the whole time and not just staring at Cameron Esposito's arms. That same night, I watched another Dropout.tv pick, Courtney Pauroso, Vanessa 5000, 4.5 stars. It is just an incredibly well-structured critique of patriarchy, which we don't get very many of those. So I appreciated it. 17th of September, I watched The Birdcage for the first time. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's The Birdcage. It's awesome. Hate their son. Wish he would go away. But it was a hoot and a half. 30th of September, I watched a film called Mosquita y Mari. This was for another gender and sexuality studies course. It's a film about two young, like, Latina girls growing up in LA, I want to say. One is undocumented, one isn't, and they form this kind of, like, homo-romantic relationship that kind of, like, you know, impacts them in a really cool way. I gave it 4 stars. We watched this film, like, actually in class, and so before that, I read a whole bunch of, like, academic articles about the film and, like, praising the film and all of this, and I have a bit of a hot take, which is that I feel like a lot of the time academics don't have the best taste in, like, media. I feel like they just don't really have a grasp on narrative if what they are, like, if what they sort of specialize in is, like, gender and sexuality studies or something like that. Like, they just, I don't know, I feel like they probably just don't consume that much, like, I don't know. I will just say, as someone who is also studying creative writing at the same time, I do often feel that a lot of the media that I'm made to watch for these courses or that gets, like, recommended, I do feel like isn't always the strongest narratively. However, that wasn't necessarily the case with Mosquita y Mari. I do feel like it was, like, overhyped by these academics, purely just from, like, a story standpoint. I thought it was pretty basic. I said in my review, the first half was just a parade of back-to-back queer coming-of-age film cliches, but the back half managed to do some actually really interesting and engaging stuff. So when I was watching it for the first half, I was like, Jesus Christ, this is just like every other queer coming-of-age film I've ever seen, and trust me, I've seen a lot of queer coming-of-age films, but then it actually did manage to do some pretty cool stuff, and so I gave it 4 stars. Okay, 5th of October, I watched Brokeback Mountain for the first time. Now I know what you're thinking. You hadn't watched Brokeback Mountain? No, I hadn't. I don't know why. I'd been putting it off for, I guess, since when I realized I was gay, so I've been putting it off for, like, 7 years. But I finally watched Brokeback Mountain on the 5th of October 2025, and I gave it 4 stars. I actually read this short story in my freshman year of college for a class, and so I was, like, familiar with it, and also I was familiar with it because it's fucking Brokeback Mountain. It's a good film. I will say it is, like, I understand why it is so important, obviously. I understand, like, the historical context of it. I will say in 2025 it is kind of unremarkable. And I think what makes it so special is the fact that it is the way that it is and that it's from 2005, and I think that if a film like it came out today, it wouldn't necessarily make too many waves, because films like it are coming out all the time now, which I think is, you know, owed very much in part to Brokeback Mountain, so I salute it for that, but I don't necessarily think that it is, like, the pinnacle of, like, queer cinema or anything like that. But I gave it 4 stars, because it's Brokeback Mountain. It's not bad. October 10th, I watched Tongues Untied for my gender and sexuality studies class. If you're not familiar, it is sort of a documentary, it's like a performance art, kind of visual poetry, kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, but It's directed by Marlon Riggs, who was, like, an incredible, like, Black queer filmmaker and writer. And I gave it 5 stars. Like I said, I don't even really know how to describe it. It's, like, half spoken word and visual poetry and, like, half sort of skit almost. And then there's, yeah, it's just, it's an incredibly cool film that I think is pretty necessary viewing. If you want to, like, engage with, like, Black queer cinema. And so I would say just watch it. Okay, we're up to the 25th movie I watched this year. On the 24th of October, I watched Pacific Rim. Now, I know what you're thinking, Lee, based off every other movie you've listed that you watched this year, why the hell did you watch Pacific Rim? And I will say, as I've said for so many movies I watched this year, watch party. The thing with having a lot of gay neurodivergent friends is that they will invite you to watch parties of their favorite movies. And I am not guilty of this. I hosted a watch party for a movie that we will get to later on this very list. But yeah, you just kind of end up going to a lot of watch parties for stuff. And this one was for Pacific Rim, which I gave 1.5 stars. I did not like Pacific Rim at all. I wrote in my Letterboxd review, who in their right mind would ever think I'd like this movie? This is an anti-Lee movie. And it just kind of is. Like, I understand why it is appealing and why people love it so much, but it is just like an anti-Lee movie. It's a movie that kind of just, it's not for me, it was never going to be for me, and I was never going to enjoy it. All of the characters were very just flat and one-dimensional. Those 2 scientist guys who my friends kept telling me, oh, they're yaoi. I was like, I don't care about either one of them, though, because they're boring as hell, and their voices annoy me. And all the dialogue was, like, kind of, it felt like a pastiche of other, like, sci-fi, like, disaster movies, and it's just kind of my pet peeve in any piece of media if it, like, spoon feeds you every little piece of information that you're supposed to know. It's why I often don't get on films' cases about being, like, too confusing unless there's, like, a real valid reason, because I prefer that to a movie that gives you every little piece of information. And Pacific Rim starts with, like, what felt like a 10-minute exposition monologue about the world and how the world got to be this way.
When alien life entered our world, it was from deep beneath the Pacific Ocean. By the time tanks, jets, and missiles took it down, 6 days and 35 miles later. And then, only 6 months later, the world came together, pooling its resources and throwing aside old rivalries for the sake of the greater good.
And from that very moment, I knew I was not going to enjoy this movie, because that's not how I like movies to work. I like to be dropped in and to have to figure it out, and it's just kind of my pet peeve when a film just tells you what's going on, because I don't like that. I enjoy having to figure it out on my own, and I just think it's just kind of indicative of weak writing, where a film doesn't trust itself enough to be able to show you. They need to tell you. You know, it's like writing 101. Show, don't tell. And this movie did a lot of telling, and it got on my nerves. Okay, then on October 31st, anyone want to guess what I watched on October 31st? That's right, I watched the Rocky Horror Picture Show. This was my 3rd time seeing Rocky Horror. I've only ever seen it as shadowcasts, which is what this is. It was a Rocky Horror shadowcast. I've never actually just, like, sat down and watched the whole movie. I've just always seen it with shadowcasts. I will accept that Rocky Horror hasn't aged great, and that there are very valid criticisms to be made, particularly a lot of, like, trans femme people critique this movie for, like, it's sort of just implicit trans misogyny, which I think is incredibly valid. However, I gave it 5 stars. I understand why people don't like this movie, and I think that is entirely within their right. I do think it's just a hell of a good time, and I really enjoy going to a Rocky Horror Shadowcast. I think that it's kind of, like, everything I love about theater all in one, of like sort of the interaction and the like parody of it is just, it's wonderful. It's a hell of a time. If you have not been to a Rocky Horror Shadowcast, I would recommend you go to one. On November 7th, I watched God's Own Country. This is another like queer film. I think it came out in like 2017, about like a young-ish man living in the middle of nowhere in England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, somewhere in the like UK. I should have written synopses for all of these, but most of these movies are movies that I assume most people have heard of. God's Own Country is one, I don't really know. But basically it's just like a sort of queer romance drama film. It's one of those films that's like very quiet and very understated, but just has so much emotional impact. I gave it 5 stars. I loved it. I don't think I'd ever actually seen anything Josh O'Connor had been in before, because like I said, I don't really watch movies. I never saw Challengers or anything like that. But he was great in this movie, and I loved it, and it made me cry. 8th of November, I watched My Own Private Idaho, and I gave that one 4 stars. Fun fact about My Own Private Idaho, unlike God's Own Country, which was available through like Canopy or something, or like one of the like video streaming services that I get through my school, My Own Private Idaho was not available on any of those. However, it was available in DVD form at my school's library. So I went at like 8 p.m. on a Saturday night, and I went to the library, and I took the DVD, and I got one of the, like, DVD viewing carols, and I went and I just watched My Own Private Idaho because I wanted to watch it. And that's how I spent my Saturday night. In the library, watching a movie on an uncomfortable chair, wearing uncomfortable headphones provided to me by the library. And I think it was a good use of my time. Like I said, I had watched Henry IV Part 1 earlier this year, so I knew that it was, like, kind of based on that, and I definitely saw those connections, and I really liked those connections. I will say, like, it wasn't as good as I thought it was gonna be. I think it's one of those films that people, like, hold up as, like, an incredible movie, and it was good, it was cool. It's also one of those films that, like I was saying, I don't usually, like, get on films' cases for being too confusing, because I prefer more confusing stuff to like straightforward stuff. It was a bit confusing and hard to follow, but like, usually I just chalk that up to me not being smart enough to understand it, or not being like well versed enough in film to understand it, because I know nothing about film or the language of film or like how cameras work or direction. I don't know. If film looked good, I say film looked good. I said it was ever so slightly nothing burger, which might be a bit harsh, but I did say ever so slightly. I do feel like there was maybe a little something missing. However, I did really like the ending. 23rd of November, I watched a film that I will actually be surprised if anyone watching this has heard of. It is a film called Criminal Queers. I watched this again for my gender and sexuality studies course. It's a, like, low-budget independent film made by, like, a bunch of queer and trans people, that follows, like, the lives of these queer and trans people who are on the run from the law, or, like, in the midst of being prosecuted for, throwing water balloons at a couple getting gay married as sort of, like, a protest to, like, the institution of marriage. And I gave it 5 stars. I had never heard of this movie before watching it. I didn't really know what to expect, and it was amazing, and I cannot believe that this movie is not, like, more popular or more talked about, because it was so fun. It's hilarious. It's so, like, campy, and it's very much like a satire. There's a part where they rob the human rights campaign, and it's hilarious. It's very much like a commentary on, like, assimilationism and all this stuff. There is a character named Gavin Noose.
Audre Lorde said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And I agree wholeheartedly. So why even try?
Which is pretty cool. There's, like, the whole thing where, like, the jury is prosecuting this trans woman who did this, and the head juror is wearing this t-shirt. He's like, and I'm so proud that, like, I'm here and I'm gay. And he's wearing this t-shirt that says, I'm gay and I'm your jury foreman.
As you may be able to tell from my shirt, I am openly and proudly gay. And I am also your jury foreman.
And I was like, I need that shirt. That shirt is so awesome. This film is so good. It features cameos from both Angela Davis and Miss Major. What's not to love? You should go watch Criminal Queers right now. Okay, we are now getting towards the end of the year. This is the 6th of December. This is the watch party that I was talking about that me and my girlfriend hosted. It is for Maurice. I gave it 5 stars because I had already given it 5 stars. It's part of my Letterboxd top 5. I love Maurice. It was actually one of the first things me and my girlfriend bonded over because we both loved Maurice. So we hosted a watch party for it. First of all, it's just a beautiful film. It looks gorgeous, and everyone in the film is gorgeous. Young Hugh Grant. What more is there to say? I love this film so much, and if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend that you go watch it, because it's really good. And one of my favorite movies of all time. 10th of December, I watched Pink Flamingos for the first time. You know, another very important, very, like, famous film within, like, the world of, like, queer cinema. I gave it 2 stars. First of all, it wasn't enjoyable to watch, which I understand is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, art, like, disturbs the comforted and whatnot. I do wish I had, like, sort of gone and looked up content warnings beforehand, but that's on me for thinking that it wouldn't be as graphic and wild as it was. And I just kind of, at the end of it, ended up feeling kind of gross for the rest of the night. I did not have fun, which is not necessarily the goal of every single movie. I understand that. That's not really where I took off points. The reason that I took off points is because of the level of sexual violence and vitriol towards women. Time after time after time, sexual violence towards women is made an absolute joke of, and a mockery of, and treated as if it's not important, or, like, as if it is able to sort of be joked about in this kind of way, and it just kind of really pissed me off. And I don't think I should necessarily be surprised that, you know, sort of one of the biggest films in, like, queer cinema history kind of, like, seems to really hate women. But, like, here we are. I didn't enjoy Pink Flamingos, and I think, I just think it's not. I think there were parts of it that were a lot of fun. I think there are parts of it that are really cool, and I understand that it's, like, supposed to be sort of taboo and subversive, but I do think there is a difference between making a film that is so full of taboos and making a film that pokes fun at people's pain in a, like, punching down way. And that's more what Pink Flamingos felt like to me. So I was very disappointed by Pink Flamingos. We're really getting close to the end now. This is the 32nd film that I watched this year. On the 13th of December, I watched, not RSC Live, but National Theater Live, The Cherry Orchard. I wasn't familiar with The Cherry Orchard before I watched this. I'm not really super familiar with any Chekhov. It hasn't really come up. And I gave this 4 stars. You know, obviously this is the first and only production of The Cherry Orchard I've ever seen, so I don't know if it was, like, faithful to the original or whatever. I do feel that it's an incredible play. It is so well written and so interesting, and I think, you know, for Chekhov, or for, like, any man writing during this time, the female characters are actually written pretty well. I will say, like, I think it's pretty good about women, actually, you know? Which might have just been the performance, but I do think it's refreshing. I, however, did not like the ending. I felt that it kind of, it wasn't, like, climactic or interesting enough for me. I think what was so interesting for me about The Cherry Orchard, was the politics of it, and about, this sort of idea of clinging to the past when the past is this kind of messed up, you know, where like the whole premise is that this family that owns the cherry orchard also used to own people. And now they don't own people, but those people still work for them for not very much money and are not always treated great. The ending sort of more harps on like this kind of how sad this family is that they must leave their childhood home. And I just think that's not super interesting because, hey, most people have to leave their childhood homes. I'm more interested in the fact that you guys used to literally own people, and the dynamics of that. I don't know, maybe I just didn't get it. I wouldn't put it past me. I also think, you know, then I was reading up on it and I, like, Chekhov was like, this is a comedy. I don't like that, who was it, Stanislavski that directed the first production, turned it into, like, this sort of tragedy. And as someone who tends to appreciate dark comedy more than just straight up melodrama, I do wish that this production had leaned into the comedy a bit more. But, oh well. This one's a doozy. 22nd of December. First film I saw in theaters this year. Hamnet. 3 stars. I did not care for Hamnet. Cue the Family Guy thing.
I did not care for The Godfather.
I will say, I also have very extensive notes about Hamnet because after I saw it, I like had so many thoughts that I was like, should I make a video just about Hamnet? And I was like, nah, I don't really feel like doing that. So I've just transferred all those notes to here. So this is gonna be a lot. Sorry. The thing I was most afraid of going into this film was that I just don't really care that much about Shakespeare's life. I care about his work. I don't really give a shit about what he did outside of it. You know, obviously I have very strong opinions about how Shakespeare's life is interpreted. See my Aunt Juliet video. But I really don't care that much about him because he was a bad guy. Because he didn't like women or Jewish people very much. And I'm kind of Jewish and kind of a woman. So I don't really like him. Yeah, I also just, like, I understand that the film is mostly fictional, as is the book that it's based on, but I don't really care about what parts of Hamlet were or were not inspired by the death of Shakespeare's son, and I in general just don't really enjoy that form of, like, literary criticism of, like, attributing parts of a person's work to their life. It doesn't interest me. I feel like it shuts down more interesting avenues of interpretation and analysis when you decide concretely that this moment in this work came from this moment in this writer's life. I think it's kind of a way to shut down more interesting and potentially more radical analysis of that person's work. There were moments like when Hamlet and Laertes' final battle is meant to mirror, like, Shakespeare and his son, like, play fighting. It just felt a little corny. Also, obviously, I don't know. I do feel like this is important to bring up. The film, there was nothing within the film itself that really made it clear that this was a dramatization and a fictionalization of Shakespeare's life. And so I do worry that audiences will kind of take it at face value and sort of assume that it is in part slightly, like, true, and, like, again, shut down more interesting analysis of Hamlet, which is just one of the most interesting plays ever written, because it's fucking Hamlet. Obviously, it's not necessarily the part of the plot, the, like, fault of the film. I don't necessarily think that it should have been included, but I do think I'm not necessarily out of my depths to suggest that maybe it should have been a bit more clear that this is not true. Because in an age of a lot of disinformation, I worry about a lot of people who aren't as informed about Shakespeare taking this as an interpretation of Shakespeare's real life, which it is not. I saw a lot of people say that, like, the final scene of the film is, like, a beautiful is like a beautiful sort of portrayal of the way that like art and grief coexist, and how like art can help heal grief. And I didn't really interpret it that way. The way that I kind of interpreted it as was that it was the trope of this like tortured artist, who's usually a man, driving away everyone they love, just because they have this obsession of making this like one perfect piece of art that once they make it will make everyone love them again and make them understand them. And that's kind of what the final scene felt like to me. It felt like this man who abandoned his wife and his children to write this play sort of, yeah, it didn't really feel believable to me that Agnes, because we can't call her Anne Hathaway because everyone will be confused, that she would have this kind of reaction and not just be like, so this is what you were working on instead of taking care of our children. Because that's what I would be like, okay, great play, where were you? And it very much, yeah, it sort of in the same way that like and Juliet kind of had Anne and Shakespeare sort of make up at the end and have her forgive him and put that sort of burden on her. I do think that Hamnet did a kind of similar thing, where Anne just had to be so moved by Hamlet that, you know, the film sort of ends on like on an uncertainty of you don't know exactly where things are going to go from here, but you know, she is so moved by this that she like kind of like that it seems that it will like change the way that she thinks about her husband and how present he has been, which I don't fuck with. Yeah, I also think that this film didn't really do justice to Anne Hathaway as a woman, as a person. A lot of times when people try to write the story of Anne Hathaway, it is still a story of Shakespeare. And I think this film was better than like an Anne Juliet about that, but I still do think that it kind of reeked of man. It had Shakespeare's stank all over it. It wasn't truly Anne's story. Anne's whole sort of witchcraft thing and this thing that she says about how like all the women in her family emerged from the woods kind of rubbed me the wrong way. It was sort of nymph-like, and it sort of kind of made her feel like she was Shakespeare's manic pixie dream girl. Yeah, I think if you're gonna write a woman who's a witch, you have to be very careful about that because of all the centuries of baggage that are attached to women as witches. And I don't necessarily think that this film did a good job of that. I think it kind of ended up falling into those tropes of like a mythical woman who dazzles and confounds this man, but who like submits to a life of domesticity for him. And obviously part of the film is that she's unhappy with that, but I still don't think that was the way to get there. Also, incredibly melodramatic, so much screaming, so much crying, not necessary. Like I have said many times already in this, I'm not really a fan of films or media that are sad for the sake of being sad, or like, I don't know, I really do just feel like that. I will admit, I cried a lot watching Hamnet. When Hamnet died, I was crying because the child actors were incredible and they really made me feel that. However, I do still think that whole sort of situation where he took her life in exchange for it was so corny. Who played Shakespeare's wife? Jessie Buckley is her name or something? I don't know. I don't really care because I didn't like the movie very much. She was doing so much crying and screaming, and you know, it was because the film kept showing her going through childbirth, and so she was screaming and crying. And I don't know, and everyone was like, wow, she did such an incredible performance. And I personally, I'm very rarely wowed by how much an actor can scream and cry, because I can also scream and cry, because everyone can scream and cry. Show me something a bit more interesting than that. And I think that's my take on most sort of films of this nature. that are so sort of obsessed with chasing those emotions, and in eliciting, like, sadness and despair from the audience, as I feel like they very often don't earn it. And I don't think that Hamnet necessarily earned it. And I was not a fan of Hamnet. I didn't like it. I didn't like what it stood for. Didn't necessarily agree with its portrayal of women. And I found it to be shallow. I didn't think it was an interesting interrogation of grief, or of love, or of Shakespeare, or of Anne. Didn't think it was really an interrogation of anything, and I think what it comes down to is I don't understand why Hamnet needed to exist. There is nothing in this film that feels unique, or that feels new, or novel, or necessary. I do not think that this is the story that needed to be told when it comes to Shakespeare's life, or his wife's life, or anything. I think there are more interesting stories to be told, and I think that this one is just not that. It's not particularly interesting, it's not particularly compelling, and I wasn't a fan. 34th film I watched this year, so this is the penultimate film I watched this year. Would you believe it? It is Shakespeare in the Park, 12th Night, which you can no longer watch for free on PBS, but you could have if you had watched it in 2025. I watched this on Christmas Eve. It was my Christmas Eve present to myself, was getting to watch Shakespeare in the Park, 12th Night. I gave it 5 stars. I won't necessarily say that it's the best production of 12th Night that's ever been put on, but it was awesome, and I had a blast. And everyone was so talented, and the costuming was so fun, and the music was so cool, and I had a wonderful time, and I loved 12th Night, and I loved this production of 12th Night. Butch Antonio was inspired. I really liked that choice. Final film I watched this year, on the 30th of December. The second film I watched in theaters this year. It was Wicked. Where do I even begin? I haven't really been following the sort of discourse surrounding Wicked because I don't care too much, so I don't really know what I am about to say has already been said, so apologies if this is like an incredibly basic analysis that has already been done. I gave Wicked 2 stars. I actually really liked part 1 of Wicked. As someone who is very familiar with the musical, who has seen the musical, I saw the musical many, many years ago, like 7 or 8 years ago, but who has seen the musical on Broadway, I really liked part 1 of Wicked. And that is even with my hot take, which is that Wicked isn't actually that great of a show. It's just that the songs are good, and so people like it. And my big fear with the Wicked movie adaptation is that what makes all of the songs so powerful is that they're being sung live. And specifically with, like, Defying Gravity, it is crazy to watch someone sing that live. And I just didn't think it was gonna have that same emotional impact on the screen. And so I was actually kind of expecting before Wicked Part 1 came out that it was gonna flop. And that people were gonna hate it, and that it was gonna get terrible reviews. And not necessarily that it was gonna bomb, but I didn't think there was gonna be a lot of interest in it. And boy was I wrong about that, because it made so much money, and people loved it. And then Part 2 came out. And, I mean, it's just sort of well understood that Act 2 of Wicked is just weaker than Act 1. And I'm not really a fan of Act 2 of Wicked. I do, however, think there are things in this film that are bad that are not necessarily attributable to the shitty source material. I think the first sort of red flag about Wicked for Good for me was when I saw that it was going to be rated PG. My mind immediately went to As Long As You're Mine, which, first of all, is the worst song in the show by far, and kind of, okay, so bit of a tangent, but I have this, like, theory that there are a couple of songs from musical theater that are specifically, I would call them sex songs that make it sound like the person writing the song has never had sex. And I will say that As Long As You're Mine absolutely falls into that category, and I think it's kind of just it's bad. It's not a good song. I don't like it. I never listened to it because it's bad. And so when I saw that Wicked was PG, I was like, wait, but what about As Long As You're Mine? They literally... So, what are they gonna do? I will say, I am surprised that the version of As Long As You're Mine that we got in the movie could pass PG, because it was suggestive. They certainly did tone it down, but there were clothes coming off. There was nudity. Not, like, visible nudity, but, like, the implication of nudity. I don't really know how ratings work. I know that back in the day, back in the 80s, before, like, PG-13 existed or whatever, a lot of stuff like that used to just get by on PG, but I did think in the current day something like that would get it labeled PG-13, but I guess not. I don't know who they had to pay off to get that PG rating, but they got the PG rating. However, I think that the fact that this movie needed to be PG did it an incredible disservice, because Act 2 of Wicked is so much darker than Act 1. There's a lot of death. There are a lot of very mature themes going on. It is about fascism. And yeah, I do feel that in an effort to make the film PG, they stripped it of most of what is interesting about Act 2 of Wicked. The, like, big thing that really pissed me off was that when the house falls on Nessa, you're supposed to see her legs and the shoes under the house, because that's one of the really iconic moments from The Wizard of Oz. But because they were chasing that PG rating, they couldn't include that. And it was really missing that sort of actual visual reminder of death. Wicked is not for kids. Maybe Act 1 could be, but Act 2 is darker, and the way that they sort of diluted the story of it in order to get that PG rating, and to make sure that it wasn't too scary for kids so that they could sell more Glinda dresses and wands and crowns, and coloring books and shit, it kind of made me a little bit sick, because as much as I don't really like Wicked, it does feel like it is going against what Wicked is about, because Wicked is about fascism. And sort of the idea that this musical based on this book that is so about fascism got turned into, like, this big commercial thing. It just, yeah, it's very ironic, and it's very upsetting to think about. Also, both the new songs were terrible. Specifically, Elphaba's new song, where she sings to those ugly-ass CGI animals about how they shouldn't flee from the Nazis, the wizards, and should instead say and fight them because nationalism. That was certainly a choice. Hey guys, you shouldn't flee to safety. You should stay here where you might die and fight, because this land is our land and we need to fight for it because Oz is ultimately good. No. I also was the most surprised out of anyone that I enjoyed Wicked Part 1, and I was most surprised out of anyone that I didn't feel like it dragged or that there was a whole bunch of unnecessary stuff in it. Obviously, they did add a lot, but I don't necessarily think that any of it took away from it too much or that it felt like it was too long. Wicked Part 2 was way too long. This is, of course, partially because Wicked Act 1 is shorter than Act 2. Act 2 is shorter than Act 1, because that's kind of just standard in a lot of musicals, because when people get back from intermission, they don't really want to sit for that long, because they just got up. And they kind of, like, it's just sort of a thing that Act 2 is, okay, it's usually a bit shorter, not always, but in a lot of musicals it is. In Wicked it is shorter. So there was a lot more that they had to add. And none of it really added anything. It was all just kind of mindless clutter. I actually have an example. In the stage version, Act 2 starts with the ensemble singing their, like, every day more wicked thing, then goes immediately into Thank Goodness, which is the opening of Act 2. Instead, in the movie, before we can get to Thank Goodness, we must watch this absolute nothing burger of a scene where Madame Morrible talks to Glinda and explains to her how her magic bubble works and show her that, like, she doesn't need to use magic and that no one will know that she's not using real magic, and reminding her that she can't do magic and that she feels bad about that. And then we are treated to a flashback of Glinda when she was a child at her birthday party, trying to do magic in front of her friends and feeling bad about how she can't do it. What this whole sequence, which takes 6-7 minutes, establishes is that Glinda can't do magic, she's embarrassed about the fact that she can't do magic, and she craves the validation of others. 3 things we already knew. The entire movie is like this. I also feel like I was cheated out of my time because I waited an hour and a half for the least spirited rendition of No Good Deed I have ever heard. Backgrounded by the cheesiest looking green screen cave? I've ever seen. And No Good Deed is the best song in the show. It sucks that it's in one of the worst parts of the show, but it goes so hard. And even No Good Deed couldn't save this movie. No Good Deed could save any movie, but not this one. I think that's all I have to say about Wicked. I say as if I haven't talked for 15 minutes. Let's see. I have some stats here. I didn't double check any of these, so they might be wrong. But I don't care. I watched 35 films, technically 34 because I watched Double Influence twice. 13 of these were actually filmed staged performances, which is 37% of the films that I watched this year. So I didn't actually watch that many movies. I mostly watched stage plays and documentaries for class. I saw 2 films in theaters, Hamnet and Wicked for Good. The lowest rating I gave a film this year was Pacific Rim, 1.5 stars. I'm gonna go through, like, all the films and the different ratings that I gave them because people always tell me that I'm a hater and that I just hate all things. And to a certain extent, I understand that that's true, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, and I kind of own the fact that I dislike most things, and I think it makes me interesting. However, I did kind of do the math, and so I just want to show you this to everyone who's ever said that I'm a hater. I only gave 1 film this year 1 to 1.5 stars. It was Pacific Rim. I gave 3 films 2 to 2.5 stars. Paper Dolls, Pink Flamingos, Wicked for Good. I gave 6 films 3 to 3.5 stars. After Stonewall, The Green Knight, Henry IV Part 1, Winter's Tale, Hamnet, Forbidden. I gave 4 films 4 stars. Mosquita e Mari, Brokeback Mountain, My Own Private Idaho, The Cherry Orchard. I gave 6 films 4.5 stars. Conclave, Call Her Ganda, Akira, 4 Pills, Vanessa 5000, The Birdcage. And I gave 14 films 5 stars. Velvet Goldmine, Terrible Influence, Bigger, Carrie and Lowell, Othello, Falsettos, The Favorite, Little Miss Sunshine, Tongues Untied, Rocky Horror, God's Own Country, Criminal Queers, Maurice, 12th Night. In conclusion, I am a fake hater. It turns out I actually like most things I watch. And maybe that's just because I only watch things that I'm pretty sure I'll like because I'm tired of watching things I don't like that make me upset. Or maybe it's because I'm actually not a hater and I'm actually a lover. And everyone's wrong when they get mad at me for being mad about stuff. Because I love things, guys. I love all movies. According to this list, I don't really dislike any movies. I also put the best new film I watched this year, I said it was God's Own Country. I obviously watched a lot of really good films for the first time this year. that was the one that I chose kind of arbitrarily, but also I think you should go watch it if you haven't watched it, because it's awesome. I don't know that I have anything else to say. If you are upset about any of the opinions that I expressed in this video, please leave a comment, a very long comment, detailing why you think I'm wrong, and watch the video a couple more times. And if you liked the video, please leave a very long comment about how awesome and correct I always am, and watch the video a couple more times. I think that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching.